Now, in this video, we're moving on in our marketing mix to the study of pricing. And pricing is really quite interesting because of all the things in our marketing mix, it's the only one that directly drives revenue. Everything else is a cost. It's expensive to advertise, it's expensive to distribute, it's expensive to actually rearrange a product. But in terms of pricing, that actually generates revenue. It's also one of the most salient things for consumers to think about. Very often when we go shopping, the first thing we consider is the cost that we incur. And so pricing is a critical component of the marketing mix. Now, there are a variety of pricing strategies out in the world, and what I'm going to do in this video is I'll highlight 3 very common ones, but I want to emphasize that these aren't 3 ideal pricing strategies. In fact, they have some serious problems with them. And after I'm done with those, I'm going to pivot to a different pricing strategy, which is considered to be a best practice in pricing. So the 3 that we're going to approach are a cost-based pricing strategy, a consumer-based pricing strategy, and a competitor-based pricing strategy. And again, these are not amazing strategies, but they certainly do exist in the world, and it's worth for us to think about what they do well and what they do poorly. So let's start with a simple one, which is a cost-based pricing strategy, also known as cost-plus pricing. And the idea here is very simple. You identify what your costs are, and then you add a margin to that. And that's the end of the entire pricing strategy. You say, if my cost to produce and distribute and sell this product is, let's say, $5 per unit, well, and I want to make 20% on that, I just take $5, increase it by 20%, and I have the answer to how to price a product. In some ways, this is setting a price floor, the bottom level for which you can charge before you start losing money. If you want a bit more formality, there's a formula that you can use to identify what this price should be. We start by saying that price is just a function of the unit cost plus whatever markup we want to include to that. But unit cost needs to be broken down into 2 components. There's unit variable cost, that's the cost associated with the materials needed to produce each unit, as well as the average fixed cost. That's the total cost that is incurred up front that needs to be distributed across all units sold. So when we calculate average fixed cost, we say that the total fixed cost, that's their total amount, is divided by the total units sold. Now, as you can imagine, this is a challenging strategy to actually enact because of that last line. We need to know in advance how many units we intend to sell or anticipate selling in order to calculate average fixed cost. Now, in some cases, that's very easy. If you're selling a commodity, then you have a very good window into what sales are going to look like. This is an easy strategy to implement. But there are many other contexts where sales fluctuate wildly across time, making this a rather challenging approach. But again, this is used in the world, and we should be thinking about it. But what I like to approach this with is a thought to the price floor. Again, this is the least that you could possibly charge in order to be profitable. There are, of course, exceptions like things like loss leaders, but we'll touch on that another time. A customer-based pricing strategy is a different approach. This is one where you literally let customers dictate the price that they're willing to pay for a product. And I know that sounds crazy, but this actually is used in the world. Often this is referred to as pay what you want pricing. As one example, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, a major museum and major nonprofit institution, does not have a fixed price for entry. They have a suggested price for entry, but anyone can pay any amount of money to enter the museum. This is pay what you want pricing. In essence, what they're doing is they're saying, rather than setting a fixed fee and withholding access to some individuals that maybe couldn't afford that fee, they're willing to take a hit on some free riders, people who will only pay $0 to enter or a small amount. They're willing to take that hit because they want to support the mission of the institution and allow everybody access, even those who can't afford their recommended fee. Now, of course, there's a secondary benefit, which is that even if you don't pay that fee, once you're in the doors of the institution, well, you might buy food at the concession stand. You might buy merchandise at the gift shop. And all of those are not, of course, pay what you want pricing schemes, and those will generate additional revenue and profit. And you can actually think of pay what you want pricing as an advertising strategy. Rather than spending money on promoting a product through, let's say, ads, you can promote it by lowering the price to the point where consumers can dictate what they in fact want to pay. And note that this is not limited to nonprofit spaces. As another example, there's a company called Humble Bundle, which aggregates independent video game manufacturers and sells them as a bundle. So they might have, say, 5 different games from 5 independent video game producers. And they sell that on occasion under a pay-what-you-want scheme. And to be clear, most people do in fact pay $0 for this. But enough people pay something above 0, they voluntarily give this money to this company that it justifies the pricing scheme. But again, think about it as an advertising strategy. You have a very uncertain product. This is independent video game makers. This is not EA. This is not some major producer. And so there's a real risk from a consumer's perspective, whether it's worth paying any money at all to buy these games. But if you can get it for free, and it turns out to be a high quality product, now you've reduced uncertainty for future purchases, which may not have this scheme. So this is a strategy that is in fact utilized both in the nonprofit and the for-profit space, but you could imagine it has some challenges. If you find that most people or all people are not willing to pay any amount of money, well then of course you don't generate enough revenue to justify the expense of actually offering a product in the first place. But as it happens, in most contexts, enough people tend to voluntarily provide some amount of money that this strategy can be effective. Now, it tends to be a little bit more effective in nonprofit spaces where foregoing payment just kind of feels gross and icky, and people don't like to do that, like you're screwing over a nonprofit institution. People don't like to do that. And so that's a place where pay what you want pricing tends to work a little bit better than in a for-profit space. It also could work quite well in a place where customers just don't know the value of the product in front of them. Like in the Humble Bundle example, if you don't know what you should be paying for this product, and if Humble Bundle doesn't actually know what they should be charging for this product in terms of value, that's a very difficult pricing problem to solve. So instead, you could let consumers dictate what the price is. Now, rather than deciding price based on cost or based on what consumers are going to pay you voluntarily, you can decide price based on what competitors are doing. This is a very simple strategy where you simply say, if a competitor of a very similar or identical product is pricing their goods at whatever price, I just follow suit. And this makes sense. That's almost a perfect substitute for one another. Price is really the salient feature that consumers go after. So if you're Coke and you charge $1 a can, and now Pepsi is deciding what to price, they really don't have a lot of flexibility. If they price too high, let's say at $2, well, Pepsi drinkers will just move over to Coke. There's certainly some loyalty, but there's a limit to that loyalty. And if they charge too low, if they charge, let's say, 50 cents, well, they might be going below their costs. And of course, Coke will just respond and lower their prices as well, often resulting in what's known as a price war, where prices continually go towards the bottom, and often the largest player who has the biggest pockets that can withstand a price war just wins. So this strategy does exist, and certainly in commoditized places, this is more common, but it has the risk of price wars, which will ultimately result in less profitability for all players involved. So if these are all questionable strategies, what should we do? So what we should do is follow economic value to customer pricing, or EVC pricing. In this scheme, we focus exclusively on value generation to consumers. It's not about what the minimum price is we can charge like in a cost structure. It's not just about what competitors are charging, although that's in there. And it's not just about what consumers are willing to pay you voluntarily. It's rather about the amount of value you can generate to convince consumers to pay more. So let's take a look at this a little bit more explicitly. We can define a situation where customers will buy a product, we'll call it product A, only if its value to them outweighs the value of their closest alternative, product B. So again, if you're imagining Coke and Pepsi, you can consider a situation where Coke is considering how to price relative to Pepsi. Well, they might say, how much additional value would customers get from buying Coke? That would dictate the price, not just what Pepsi happens to be charging. Anyway, what we would say is that there's an inequality that has to be fulfilled for customers to be willing to pay the price that I'm charging. We would say that the utility that a consumer derives from product A, my product, must be greater than or equal to the utility of the nearest competitor, product B. We can decompose utility and simply say that utility is value minus price. So the value of my product provided to consumers minus the price of my product is the utility that someone gets, and the same for the competitor. And then we can rearrange those to solve for price of my product, because ultimately that's what we're trying to answer. And when we do that, we get this inequality. And what this inequality is saying is that the price that I set must be less than or equal to all those things on the right. And what that implies is that this is a price ceiling. This is the most you could possibly charge. And when we think about what's on the right side of that equation, we see that in those brackets, that's your differentiating value. That is the additional value that your product generates for consumers above and beyond your nearest competitor. And of course, we add to that the price that that competitor is charging. So again, to be concrete, if your competitor is charging $100 for a product, that would be price B, and you believe you can generate $100 of additional value for a customer, well then you know that the most you could possibly charge is $200. Now, we don't necessarily always want to charge at the maximum price, at this ceiling. In fact, there are some cases where we want to charge pretty close to it, but there are other cases where we want to stay far, far away from that maximum price. And let's take a look at those two different situations. The first situation is something that we call the end benefit effect. This is when a product is an essential part of a known end use. So for example, in the wedding industry, Flowers in a traditional American wedding are instrumental to the wedding itself. It's critical that a bride carries that bouquet. And florists know this, and will price a bouquet much higher if it's being sold for a wedding than if it's being sold for anything else. And why do they do that? Because they know they could extract as much possible revenue from you because the value you derive in this situation is quite high. There's no alternative, and so you're stuck purchasing this particular product. You could also imagine situations where we call a shared cost effect. This is where you're not the only one paying for the product, but perhaps someone else is, like an employer. So think about the case of business travelers staying at hotels. In most cases, they're not paying out of pocket, but their employer is actually covering those expenses. Now, there's not an infinite budget, of course. You have to be responsible with how you spend your money. But business hotels understand that they can charge more when the consumer is not the one actually paying, even though the value is being directed towards the consumer. Consumers are more willing to pay up to that ceiling price when they're not the ones actually footing the bill. And so when you find yourself in those types of situations, you again are likely to charge quite high to that price ceiling. And then the last one is a little close to home because I study psychology. It's this idea of mental accounts. Now, if you don't know about mental accounts, I'd suggest actually taking the consumer behavior course we offer here at Tepper. But the quick version of that is that consumers don't typically treat money as what we call fungible. In reality, a dollar is a dollar is a dollar, right? You could spend it on anything, but consumers tend to have these mental budgets or accounts where they allocate some pool of money to, say, rent, and another pool of money to, say, groceries, and another to entertainment, and another to travel, and so on. And what we know is that when consumers are considering mental accounts that are more discretionary, like travel funds or entertainment funds, they tend to be willing to spend more up to that maximum value because they're less price conscious and more interested in extracting the most they possibly can. So if you find yourself in a business where consumers' mental accounts are more discretionary, you again can charge closer to that maximum ceiling price. Now on the flip side, there are times you might want to charge much lower than that ceiling price. In fact, when there's uncertainty about what that value is and how it is generated, even if you as the firm know that it's providing a lot of value, but a consumer might not. And so in those types of situations where there's uncertainty about what value is actually being generated, it's much more beneficial to charge lower than that maximum price in order to avoid an overpricing situation. This tends to play out quite a bit for new product features and new value. I often think about my iPhone over here. I remember when the first iPhone came out, and I said, there's no way this will be a good product because there's no physical keyboard with tactile response. Now, obviously, I was dead wrong, but I was facing a new product where the value of that screen was still unknown to me. It was completely novel, and I didn't have a way to calibrate. Now, eventually, of course, I came around, and I now realize how much value that this particular product provides. But because it was new and unknown, I was never willing to pay up to that ceiling price. And lastly, we absolutely have to consider legal and ethical issues. A classic example of this, an unfortunate one, is that of an EpiPen. Now, an EpiPen is a life-saving device. If somebody has severe allergies and they go into anaphylactic shock, an EpiPen can literally save their life. So if you think about it in terms of value, it's basically infinite, right? We would give all of our money to save our life. And so a medical manufacturer can choose to price quite high. Now, there's a real ethical concern in doing this, and the EpiPen is a classic example where this exactly happened, that the company was bought out, and since they had the sole right to manufacture this product, they started jacking up prices to a point that it got a lot of press attention and became a problem. But fundamentally, it was a problem because of ethics. It was a problem because somebody understood that in this medically necessary situation, price and value are nearly infinite. And so you can charge much, much higher because people don't have a choice. Now, is that good for the bottom line? Probably. Is it good for society? And is it moral and ethical? Probably not. And those are situations where we have to be very careful. Now, there's also the legal side of things. Price gouging is illegal in the wake of emergencies. If there's a hurricane, you can't just start charging $20 a bottle of water. That is against the law, at least in the United States. It's also unethical, but it does happen. Think of the beginning of COVID. When we didn't know what was going on, we all believed that hand sanitizer was going to save us. That's not quite true anymore. And what happened was there was a shortage of hand sanitizer, and some people took advantage of this. There's one story of a gentleman acquiring 17,700 bottles of hand sanitizer with the intent to resell them at a premium. Now, he was caught. I don't know if he went to jail or not, or was fined or not, but he was certainly shut down in terms of sales, and now he's stuck with all those bottles. Now, was he going to make money if he was able to do this? Yeah, of course he would. It would have been very profitable. Was it ethical to do so? No. In fact, it was not just unethical, it was also illegal. And so these are situations where you really can't be charging up to the maximum value, even though it was quite high. You probably should be staying far, far away from that maximum ceiling price that an EVC pricing scheme would suggest you follow. Pricing is a phenomenally interesting topic, and there's a lot more we can discuss. But again, since this is a refresher course, that's where we're going to stop, and instead we're going to move on to our next P in the subsequent video.